Well, I think the first thing that we as a leadership team had to work from is that I, as a white person, can't understand other cultures until you take the time to sit down alongside people. And so I think the first step for us was trying to ask that question ourselves. And so we conducted a bunch of student empathy interviews in order to try and get a better understanding of what is the nature of that experience for students. Because I didn't know that question. So we learned a lot from families in that process. What we found out is that, and I think this is true about a lot of schools where you have predominantly people coming from white individualistic cultures that are in positions where they're making decisions about instruction and making decisions about how things are structured, that they bring their own cultural experiences and cultural norms. And when they come from mostly individualistic cultures, that's how classrooms are structured. And so I think shifting that focus is a part of what we're trying to do here. I think a few things: that it's more than just traditions and dress and holidays and language, that there's much more depth to it, and specifically teachers. What teachers need to understand about culture is the difference between individual and collective cultures, and what engagement looks like in those cultures. So that a student who is boisterous and is over talking, interrupting, and is highly engaged in talking to peers is actually an engaged student and is not being silenced. And I think what teachers need to understand is students that come from families and community gatherings where that's the cultural asset, that's the cultural norm, and their 12 or 11 or 9 years of experience in schools is I need to code switch. So I have to shut that part of my person and who I am and my identity off when I walk through the doors. To me, that's a fundamental change. That's something that has to absolutely shift, is that those of us that come from more individualistic cultures have to be more understanding of how our systems and how our instructional practices need to shift to bring in more collective aspects to engage those assets that are within our students, and to get past our implicit bias that they're somehow acting out, rather than the truth is they're actually really engaged. So I think culture responsive teaching means that you're taking a critical pedagogy lens and theory about looking at race, looking at culture, and looking at the way that we do business in schools and have traditionally done business. And then you look to interrupt those ways by, number one, providing training to teachers about what those shifts are, and by two, providing dialogue for people to develop activities that kind of bridge that gap. So for us, culture responsive teaching means we're looking at our individualistic practices and we're trying to make a shift and balance to more collective sort of content-based activities, not just building relationships in kids and having strong relationships where kids feel connected, because that's certainly a part of it, but that's where I think schools kind of stop. And that's why I really see this as really kind of a 2 or 3 year process for us, because that shift from individualistic cultures to having people become not only self-aware, adopting a new identity, and working within that identity that's not a strength for them. It's going to take some time and some feedback and some vulnerability for people to feel like they can make that shift and feel supported in that shift. Yeah, there's 2 different frameworks we're going to adopt. One is, not even all of our teachers know this yet, so you guys are getting a little bit of advance notice, but we have invested some significant resources into bringing an AVID pathway training here in November. We're going to let teachers opt into that. We have 40 slots to fill, so almost half of our teaching staff is going to have an opportunity to go through a 2-day training that's just about empowering teachers. And it's literally 2 days of training around different types of activities that are not just relational building, but how to structure that within your content. We also wrote a grant to the Miller Family Foundation to bring in the Zaretta Hammond framework, Culture Responsive Teaching in the Brain, which talks about the scientific kind of piece of this and a lot of the pieces that you guys are talking about in your class, but also layers like stuff that's within the critical pedagogy, stuff that's in critical race theory, and overlaps it with what's going on in science around how the brain works, especially with students who I think have been largely misunderstood in classes as being disengaged when they're not really, and letting teachers develop those activities that might match those frameworks. So you'll hear, what you're going to hear in staff development over the next 2 years is talking about becoming warm demanders, and that's part of that Zaretta Hammond framework. So the framework for the Tualatin Way, which is we care, all of you matter, and you're the future, actually comes from the teaching tolerance world. It's language that we've been playing around for about a year or so. And what it comes down to is we want to get to a place of meaningful inclusion. That's the thinking behind it. That I feel like the school is built for the students. It's not built for anyone else. So if we truly are doing our job, every single student at Tualatin High School feels like this is their home. And that it's not just the physical space, but it's classroom activities, it's interactions with adults, interactions with each other, but that they feel that support instead of feeling completely marginalized or feeling like they're set aside, that the dominant culture is going to make, that all the decisions in the building, all decisions about instruction, all decisions about resources are all run through kind of traditional dominant practices. Now, we're talking about changing something that's fundamental in education for 200 years. So that shift is going to be messy at times, but that's what I see part of the Tualatin Way is that we have to not just think about navigation. How do we help students navigate the systems? We have to look at our systems and say, if they're not equitable, we need to change them. And I think that's part of what the Tualatin Way is, the messaging to students and staff that this is what the school is about.